When it comes to best ball, there are many different ways to skin the proverbial cat. In recent years, we've seen zero RB flourish, but we've also seen dual RB start to win millions of dollars. Year to year, the magic formula of winning it all changes slightly depending on which players break out, but there are some constants that remain, and this video will set you right on the path for winning big in 2024. 1. Understand what your early picks mean. We rarely want to go into a draft with a predetermined strategy in mind. But pretty soon into the draft, we have to make up our mind. If you go wide receiver in round 1, are there any running backs in round 2 who are worth a hero RB start? Here's the current ADP on Underdog. If you're picking up a 102, 103, 104, or even 105, you might not have a choice to go with a running back in the second round without reaching. How many of these round 1 or round 2 running backs are even good choices for hero running back? 2? Maybe 3? If not in rounds 1 to 2, when are you taking your first running back? For many of us, that kind of start means that we might want to wait till rounds 5 to 6 to take our first running back. Avoid the running back dead zone that constantly chews up running backs in that range, despite year to year there being different types of running backs in that range. In 2022, there were 10 dead zone running backs. Only 4 of them had positive advance rates, meaning advancing to the best ball playoffs. And 2 of the positive advance rates came from round 3 players who, in hindsight, perhaps they were just priced incorrectly. In 2023, the dead zone was similarly volatile. 9 of the 14 running backs in the dead zone finished below where their ADP cost, with 6 of those 9 over 15 spots below the positional ADP they had. And that's even when we go with points per game rather than total points. If you start with a running back in the first 2 rounds, it's important to make sure that you draft plenty of wide receivers quickly after that, make up for missing out on them early on. Otherwise, you could be left with Jacoby Myers as your wide receiver 2. No offense, Jacoby. Remember, you can either draft running backs early or draft a lot of running backs. You can't do both. Tip number 2 coming right up. But first, while you're here, hit that subscribe button down below. We have so much best ball content coming your way in the next few months, not to mention all of Rich's dynasty and rookie content. Tip 2, draft lots of wide receivers early. Expanding slightly on the previous point, getting the wide receiver position right is essential. Mike Leone found in his best ball manifesto for establishing a run that historically having 7 to 8 wide receivers on a roster performed best, and ones performing at the best of the best had spent plenty of their draft capital on wide receivers early on. It is possible to leave a draft with only 6 wide receivers. In fact, Hayden Winks of Underdog Fantasy wrote about this in April 2022. Teams that finished with 6 or 7 wide receivers after hammering the position early averaged an above 20% advance rate compared to a 15.7% win rate for teams that drafted 9 or 10 wide receivers after hammering the position early. Not only is drafting fewer wide receivers more productive, but it's also more contrarian. There were only 3,622 teams that went with the 6 to 7 wide receiver route versus 8,415 teams that had 9 to 10 wide receivers. And the 8 wide receiver teams were still performing worse than the 6 to 7 wide receiver teams and were the most popular. So if we're taking this approach, you want to prioritize getting those wide receivers quick and early. On Underdog, wide receivers dry up fast, with 41 of the first 72 picks being wide receivers. So typically you want to aim to have 5 drafted by the time you get to round 9. This holds true on DraftKings PPR format as well, where in 2022, 49% of teams that reached Millie Maker finals had 5 wide receivers by round 10. Only 5% of the 989 teams to make the finals survived that round with 0 wide receivers before they got to round 4. And only 1.5% of teams in the final managed to make it there, taking no wide receivers before round 5. Using RotoViz's roster construction explorer, we can see teams that drafted their 5th wide receiver before round 9 had multiple routes to success on Underdog between 2021 and 2022. Meanwhile, if we look at teams selecting their 5th wide receiver after round 9, you can see a lot less advance rates above the baseline of 16.7%. Number 3, round 7 to 10 are when we want to hit RB. When we pass the dead zone and we've got close to drafting those 5 wide receivers that are so essential, now it's time to start taking shots at the running back position. In 2022, this was an area of the draft where Josh Jacobs, Tony Pollard, Dameon Pierce, and Miles Sanders all crushed their expectations. In 2023, David Montgomery, Alvin Kamara, Rashad White, Isaiah Pacheco, and Raheem Mostert all finished inside the top 15 RBs in half PPR points per game while being drafted in this range. Further back in 2021, Leonard Fournette and James Conner were league winners from this range of the draft. The running backs have question marks here, whether it be age, ability, role, or any number of things, but typically someone outperforms their ADP here, and it's a good idea to spread out your exposures if you don't have a strong conviction on one of these players. Every time one of these running backs in this range fail, you gain leverage on your league mates if you've drafted the right one. 4. Player archetypes matter. In the DraftKings 2023 Millie Maker Final, there were 45 different variations of roster combinations. The most popular was a 3-6-8-3, meaning 3 quarterbacks, 6 running backs, 8 wide receivers, and 3 tight ends. What commonly brought all these different types of teams to the final was having the right players on those rosters. Christian McCaffrey was a dominant player in 2023 fantasy football, single-handedly dragging many rosters into the playoffs. He had a 42% advance rate. McCaffrey is the very definition of a hero running back. He has not only an elite workload, but also an established role in the receiving game that's just as strong as his rushing production. When building rosters, we have to be aware of the players that we're designating into certain roles. Derrick Henry continues to defy time, but due to the way he plays the game, he has to hit on a large number of touchdowns every year to make up for his lack of work in the receiving role. This is a bet that's paid off for some in years past, but as Henry's playing time has dwindled, his viability in hero RB builds has too. If you start an RB out of the gate, do both these players have the upside to start in your roster 80% of the time? If not, are they worth the opportunity cost that comes from selecting them over the wide receivers in the early rounds? This point also applies to wide receivers. We want a mix of the right archetypes in every roster. Having dominant alpha wide receivers, it's a great start, but as we get further down the draft, we'll struggle to find them. So it becomes a balancing act of adding some players with a safe floor with those with high ceilings. The last thing you want to do is have a roster of slot-only wide receivers who fail to hit if they don't get into the end zone. The same could be said for deep threat, big play wide receivers. They're fun when they hit, but too many on one roster, it can just leave you languishing in last place. One last point to come, but one last time. I know 80% of people watching this video don't subscribe. Help me help you in 2024. This is the year you can crush it, and it starts with you hitting that subscribe button down below. Number 5. Spread out exposure to late round picks. Players later on in ADP have the chance to be league winners. Ever heard of Kyron Williams or Puka Nacua? It's possible it's years before we see players hit as large as they did from the late rounds, but this area of the draft is perfect for taking shots. Running backs in this range frequently see massive jumps in ADP if there's an off-season injury to the starters ahead of them. There are also plenty of players who, even at this point in the off-season, are unsigned, and they could see a sizable jump in their ADP once they land with a team. And don't forget that some teams' fortunes will be vastly improved coming out of the NFL draft, so there's players here who will be pushed up the draft boards as we feel more positive about that team's outlook. Pete Overzet recently released a video called How to Outsmart ADP, and brought the Badge Bros winning strategy of scroll the F down from daily drafts to season-long contests. In it, he highlighted this quote from Sacrilegious, part of Pat Crane's legendary Upside team. It isn't that ADP ever stops mattering entirely, just that it matters less progressively the later you get into a draft, and the other factors start to outweigh it by so much that it doesn't seem to matter. Nez of the Badge Bros expanded on this point, highlighting that when we ignore ADP, it should be in favor of things like stacking and roster construction rather than just aimlessly clicking. In other words, it's an area of the draft we should be using to make tactical decisions and build rosters different to our competition. Looking back to 2023 ADP, 92 players consistently had an ADP of between 150 to 220 on Underdog, equivalent to a mid-12th round pick onwards. Of course, many players, they find their way in and out of this range between April and September. These 92 provide us with some perspective. Quarterbacks. 13 quarterbacks were drafted in this range and 3 finished inside the top 10 at the position, with a further 3 finishing as top 15 players. Running backs. 27 running backs were drafted in this range, with Kyron Williams the standout, finishing as RB2 overall. In 2022, 4 running backs in this range finished as an RB3, which means top 36 or better. But in 2023, that number jumped slightly to 5. 78% of running backs in this range averaged less than 10 PPR points per game, but 29% of these players had 9 or more usable weeks as a top 36 running back. Only 7 backs in this range failed to have a single top 36 week. 29 wide receivers were part of this sample, with 4 finishing inside the top 30 of a position, a big jump from 2022 when only Zay Jones accomplished that feat. That year, 5 receivers averaged over 10 PPR points and 9 had at least 5 usable weeks as a top 36 option. In 2023, 7 receivers averaged over 10 points a game, and the same number had at least 5 usable weeks. Late round tight end was relatively productive for the second year running. Cole Kmet, Trey McBride, Jake Ferguson all did great for tight ends in the late round areas in 2023. Outside of those 3, no tight end out of the 21 in this sample had more than 5 top 12 weekly finishes, but 6 had 10 or more top 24 performances. These stats help to tell part of the story. We want usable weeks from our players in best ball, and preferably lots of them. This table shows us how many weeks a quarterback or tight end average should finish inside the top 24 at the position, and how many weeks a running back or wide receiver average should finish inside the top 36. When we see the numbers laid out like this, it becomes obvious how tricky it can be to hit on players in this range. While each year there'll be players like Brock Purdy, Jerome Ford, or Zach Moss, occasionally even the likes of Kyron Williams and Puka Nacua. There'll also be the likes of Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Jalen Hyatt, Chase Claypool, players who sit as dead weights on your bench for much of the season. Taking a methodical approach to this area of the draft, it can lead to some bust, but it can also help us land on the dynamite selections too. One sensible approach is to spread your exposure depending on the rounds you're in. The earlier the pick, the more potential it has to ruin a team if you're hit by injuries, suspension, or poor performances. Depending on the number of drafts you do, these numbers can look quite different. But if you're doing over 100 drafts, I like to stick to roughly this approach. Rounds 1 to 3, 15% max exposure. Rounds 4 to 6, 20% max exposure. Round 7 to 10, 25% max exposure. Round 11 to 14, 30% max exposure. And then round 15 to 20, 35% max exposure. When players get to these levels, it doesn't always mean it's time to stop drafting them. These levels act as a trigger for me to look at that player's situation again. Am I comfortable taking an aggressive stand on them? Have I been overdrafting them? How long is it going to take me to bring their exposure back down to a more acceptable range if there's a problem? Even when we're entirely positive that Chase Claypool is cheap in the last round and this is finally his year, there are so many unknowns at this point of drafting. So taking as many shots as possible at different players, it's just a sensible choice. It can become easy to miss out on players like Kyron Williams, Puka Nacua, and CJ Stroud by getting too hyper-focused on certain late-round flyers. But we can avoid this by spreading that exposure a little bit thinner and just trying to hit on a wider range of players in the hopes one of them will be on the perfect roster for us. Those are your 5 tips for drafting a winning best ball roster. Leave me your favorite tip in the comments below. Hit the subscribe button so that you are ready for the rest of the best ball strategy content I am going to bring you this off season.